The rope that killed Augustus Whitmore was unlike any hemp or cotton cord the Virginia constabulary had ever seen. When they cut down his body from the hanging post behind his textile factory, the noose dissolved in their hands like morning mist, leaving behind only the faintest shimmer of what looked like spider's silk catching the dawnlight. But no spider on earth could spin thread strong enough to support the weight of a grown man, and no earthly explanation could account for how that thread had woven itself around his neck in patterns so intricate they resembled fine lace. The year was 1833, and the Industrial Revolution had reached even the rolling hills of rural Virginia. Augustus Whitmore had built his fortune on the backs of young women and children who worked 16-hour shifts in his cotton mill, their fingers bleeding from handling the rough fibers, their lungs slowly filling with cotton dust that would claim most of them before their 30th birthdays. He paid them barely enough to survive and housed them in cramped boarding houses where disease spread like wildfire through the overcrowded rooms. But Augustus had made one fatal error in his pursuit of profit. He had hired Evangeline Thorne. She arrived at the mill on a cold February morning, her application letter written in handwriting so precise it looked like printed type. At 35, she was older than most of the mill girls, but her references were impeccable. Previous employers in Massachusetts praised her skill with even the most delicate fabrics, her ability to repair tears so seamlessly they became invisible, her talent for creating patterns that seemed to move and breathe with life of their own. What they didn't mention, what they couldn't have known, was that Evangeline's needlework had been taught to her by her grandmother, who had learned it from her grandmother before her, in an unbroken chain stretching back to the old country, where such skills were considered more than mere craftsmanship. Augustus hired her immediately, impressed by her portfolio of work samples. The fabric roses that seemed to bloom under candlelight, the embroidered vines that appeared to grow across the cloth when viewed from different angles, the delicate lacework that captured light and shadow in ways that defied explanation. "You'll oversee the girls on the 3rd floor," he told her, his eyes already calculating the profits her expertise would generate. "Make sure they keep up with their quotas. I don't tolerate laziness in my establishment." Evangeline simply nodded, her pale green eyes taking in the factory floor with its rows of exhausted workers, some barely out of childhood, bent over their looms and spinning wheels. She watched a young girl of perhaps 12 collapse from exhaustion and saw how Augustus merely gestured for 2 older workers to drag her aside and continue production. "What happens to the ones who can no longer work?" she asked quietly. "They're replaced," Augustus replied with casual indifference. "There's always more where they came from." That night, in the cramped boarding house room she shared with 3 other mill workers, Evangeline unpacked her sewing kit. But this was no ordinary collection of needles and thread. The case was carved from wood so dark it seemed to absorb light, and the implements within gleamed with an inner radiance that had nothing to do with polished metal. Her needles were made from the bones of her ancestors, passed down through 7 generations of women who had sewn more than cloth. Her thread was spun from materials gathered under specific moon phases, blessed with words in languages that predated written history, and her thimble, worn smooth by countless fingers, bore engravings that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. Evangeline began her work that very night. She started small, repairing tears in the workers' clothing with stitches that held longer than they should have, strengthening fabric that should have fallen apart from wear. She embroidered protective symbols into the linings of their dresses, patterns that seemed to deflect the worst of the machinery's dangers. Workers began to notice that they felt less tired at the end of their shifts, that their coughs cleared up, that small cuts and burns healed faster than before. Augustus noticed too, but for different reasons. Production efficiency was increasing, and fewer workers were calling in sick or collapsing during their shifts. He attributed this to better management and pushed the quotas even higher. It was then that Evangeline decided more direct action was needed. She began with Augustus's personal wardrobe. As overseer, she had access to his office where he kept spare clothing for his frequent overnight stays at the mill. Working by lamplight after her regular shift, she carefully removed the stitching from his coats and shirts, then re-sewed them with thread of her own creation. To any observer, the garments looked identical to before, but Evangeline had woven something else into the fabric, something that would grow stronger with each wearing, each movement, each breath Augustus took while clothed in her handiwork. The first sign that something was changing came 3 weeks later. Augustus complained to his housekeeper that his clothes felt tight, though he hadn't gained weight. His shirts seemed to constrict around his chest, his coats pulled at his shoulders. He blamed the laundry service for shrinking his garments and ordered new ones made. But Evangeline was ready for him. Every new garment that entered Augustus's wardrobe received the same treatment. Thread so fine it was invisible to the naked eye was woven through the existing fabric, creating a secondary structure that responded to forces other than physical tension. As days passed, Augustus found it increasingly difficult to breathe deeply, as if something was gradually tightening around his torso. His physician could find nothing wrong. His lungs were clear, his heart strong. Yet Augustus gasped for air, like a fish out of water, particularly during the day when he wore his business attire. Only at night, dressed in his nightclothes which had somehow escaped Evangeline's attention, could he breathe easily. The mill workers began to notice their employer's distress, and word spread quickly through their ranks. Evangeline observed their growing hope with satisfaction, but she knew her work was far from complete. Augustus's discomfort was only the beginning. She began the second phase on a night when the moon was dark and the mill was empty, except for her solitary figure moving through the machinery. From her sewing kit, she withdrew spools of thread, unlike any manufactured in earthly mills. This thread had been spun from moonbeams and shadow, from the silk of spiders that fed on dreams and nightmares. It was invisible to most eyes, but those with the sight could see it glowing faintly with its own inner light. Working through the night, Evangeline began to weave this supernatural thread through the very structure of the mill. She stitched it into the wooden beams, wound it around the machinery, threaded it through the walls themselves. By dawn, she had created an invisible web that connected every part of Augustus's empire with threads that responded to her will alone. The effect was gradual but unmistakable. The mill began to feel different to those who worked within it. The harsh edges seemed softer, the deafening noise of the machinery somehow muted. Workers reported that the very air felt lighter, easier to breathe. Even the cotton dust that had plagued them for years seemed less irritating to their lungs. But for Augustus, the mill became increasingly oppressive. The threads Evangeline had woven throughout the building created a network of pressure that seemed to focus on him alone. Whenever he entered his factory, he felt as if he were walking into a spider's web, with invisible strands clinging to his skin and gradually tightening around his body. His breathing problems worsened. His sleep became fitful, filled with dreams of being wrapped in silk and slowly suffocated. He began to lose weight as eating became difficult, the threads in his clothing making it hard to swallow. His business associates noticed his declining appearance and began to whisper about his fitness to run such a large operation. It was during this period of increasing distress that Augustus made the mistake that would seal his fate. He decided to make an example of one of the younger workers, a girl named Mary, who had been caught taking scraps of fabric home to patch her younger brother's torn clothing. "Theft is theft, regardless of the amount," Augustus declared in front of the assembled workers. "This girl will be dismissed immediately and reported to the authorities. Let this be a lesson to all of you." Evangeline watched from the third floor as 12-year-old Mary was dragged from the building, her wages confiscated, her future destroyed for the crime of trying to keep her family warm. That night, she began the final phase of her plan. In her room, she laid out lengths of the special thread she had been preparing for weeks. This was different from anything she had used before, spun from materials that existed only in the spaces between the physical world and the realm of spirits. The thread seemed to move of its own accord, writhing slightly as if alive, responding to the emotions and intentions of its creator. Evangeline began to weave, but not on any conventional loom. She worked with her hands alone, her fingers dancing through the air as the thread formed patterns of extraordinary complexity. She was creating a noose, but one unlike any that had ever been crafted. This rope would be strong enough to support any weight, yet fine enough to be invisible to most observers. It would tighten only around those who deserved its embrace, and once closed, it would never loosen again. As she worked, Evangeline whispered words her grandmother had taught her, words that called upon the spirits of all who had died from the cruelty of men like Augustus. With each stitch, each twist of the thread, she wove their anger and their demand for justice into the very structure of the rope. By dawn, her work was complete. The noose hung in the air before her, visible to her eyes as a shimmer of silver and shadow, but invisible to anyone without the sight. She could feel its power thrumming through the air, eager to fulfill its purpose. Augustus arrived at the mill that morning, barely able to walk upright. The threads in his clothing had grown so tight overnight that he could barely move his arms, and each breath was a struggle. His face had taken on a greyish pallor, and his eyes bulged slightly from the constant pressure around his throat. "I need air," he gasped to his foreman. "I need to step outside." But there was no relief to be found outdoors. The invisible web Evangeline had created extended beyond the mill building itself, reaching into every corner of Augustus's property. Wherever he went, he carried the weight of his crimes with him, manifested as an ever-tightening network of supernatural thread. As the day wore on, Augustus grew increasingly desperate. He tore at his collar, loosened his cravat, even removed his coat entirely. But the pressure around his throat continued to increase. Workers stopped their machines to stare as their employer stumbled through the mill floor, clawing at his neck, gasping for air that seemed to thin with each passing hour. "Sir, should we call for a physician?" asked one of the supervisors. Augustus tried to respond, but found he could barely speak. The words came out as a harsh whisper, barely audible above the noise of the machinery. He gestured frantically toward his office, hoping to find some relief in familiar surroundings. But his office offered no sanctuary. If anything, the feeling of constriction was worse there, surrounded by the evidence of his wealth built on others' suffering. The ledgers filled with profit calculations based on human misery, the contracts that bound workers to impossible terms, the correspondence with other mill owners sharing techniques for maximizing productivity while minimizing costs. As evening approached, Augustus made his way to the back of the mill property where a wooden post stood, originally erected for announcements and notices. He leaned against it, gasping for breath, his vision beginning to blur from lack of oxygen. It was then that Evangeline appeared. She had been working late, as was her custom, but now she stood in the doorway watching Augustus struggle. In her hands, she held what appeared to be empty air, but Augustus could see it now in his extremity. The noose, shimmering with otherworldly light, beautiful and terrible in its deadly perfection. "You," he wheezed, finally understanding. "It was you." Evangeline said nothing, but began to walk toward him. With each step she seemed to grow, not just in height, but in presence. Her shadow stretched across the ground, covering Augustus in darkness that felt thick as syrup. Her pale green eyes blazed with the accumulated anger of every worker who had suffered under his rule. "Please," Augustus gasped, falling to his knees. "I'll change. I'll pay them more. I'll improve conditions." "Will you bring back the dead?" Evangeline asked, her voice carrying undertones of wind through hollow places. "Will you restore the lungs destroyed by your cotton dust? Will you return the years stolen from children who should have been playing instead of working?" Augustus tried to run, but found his legs would not obey. The threads that had been tightening around him all day had finally bound him completely, invisible chains that held him fast against the wooden post. Evangeline raised her hands, and the noose she had crafted descended from above, settling around Augustus's neck with the gentleness of a mother's touch. The thread felt soft as silk against his skin, but he knew with absolute certainty that it would hold. "This rope was woven from the dreams of the dead," she told him, as the noose tightened. Every child who died in your mill, every woman who coughed up blood from your cotton dust, every man who worked himself to death for wages that barely bought bread, their hopes, their fears, their final moments of pain, all spun together into this single strand of justice. Augustus tried to speak, to plead, to bargain, but the rope had closed his throat. As consciousness faded, he saw Evangeline begin to change, her human form expanding and stretching until she towered above him like a giantess woven from moonlight and shadow. "And when they find you in the morning," her voice boomed from somewhere high above, "this rope will return to the realm from which it came, taking with it all evidence of how justice was served." The last thing Augustus saw was Evangeline's transformed figure reaching up to secure the other end of the supernatural rope to a branch that seemed to materialize from thin air 20 feet above the ground. They found his body at dawn, just as Evangeline had predicted. Augustus Whitmore hung from the wooden post behind his mill, suspended by what appeared to be the finest thread imaginable. The local constable, a man named Thompson, who had investigated his share of hangings, had never seen anything like it. "Look at this," he called to his deputy, pointing at the noose around the dead man's neck. "I've never seen rope work like this. It's like lace, but strong enough to hold his weight." The deputy reached up to examine the hanging cord, but the moment his fingers touched it, the entire thing dissolved. They watched in amazement as the rope simply vanished, leaving no trace behind, except Augustus's body collapsing to the ground. "What in blazes?" Thompson muttered, staring at his empty hands. "Where did it go?" A thorough search of the area yielded no evidence of any rope or cord. The wooden post showed no signs of having had anything attached to it, yet dozens of witnesses had seen Augustus's body hanging 20 feet in the air, suspended by what could only have been some form of cordage. The official investigation was brief and inconclusive, with no evidence of foul play and no apparent means by which Augustus could have hanged himself at such a height. The death was classified as an accident of unknown cause. The mill was sold to pay debts, and the new owners immediately implemented better working conditions and fair wages for their employees. Evangeline remained at the mill for several months after Augustus's death, training the new management in humane labor practices and teaching the workers skills that would serve them well in years to come. But she was not the same woman who had arrived that cold February morning. Those with eyes to see noticed that Evangeline seemed somehow larger than before, as if her victory over Augustus had allowed her to expand beyond normal human limitations. Her shadow fell longer than it should have. Her voice carried farther than physics allowed. When she worked at her loom, witnesses reported that her hands moved so quickly they blurred, creating fabric of impossible beauty and strength. The thread she spun was unlike anything the textile industry had ever produced. It was stronger than steel, yet softer than silk, and garments made from it seemed to protect their wearers from harm. Workers who wore clothing patched with Evangeline's thread found themselves immune to accidents, their health improving rather than declining despite the harsh conditions of mill work. But perhaps most remarkably, anyone who treated workers with cruelty while wearing fabric touched by Evangeline's hands found that their clothing began to tighten around them, gradually becoming more and more uncomfortable until they were forced to change their ways or remove the garments entirely. Word of the mysterious seamstress spread throughout the textile industry. Mill owners from as far away as Boston traveled to Virginia hoping to hire her, drawn by stories of her supernatural skill with needle and thread. But Evangeline was selective about her employers, accepting positions only with those who demonstrated genuine concern for their workers' welfare. Those who tried to deceive her, who promised fair treatment while planning to return to exploitative practices once they had secured her services, found themselves experiencing difficulties similar to what had befallen Augustus Whitmore. Their clothing would begin to constrict, their breathing would become labored, and they would find themselves compelled to honor their promises or face increasingly severe consequences. By 1835, Evangeline had vanished from Virginia entirely, leaving behind only stories of her remarkable abilities and a textile industry that had been fundamentally transformed by her influence. Mill owners throughout the region had implemented new safety standards and wage structures, not out of altruism, but from a very real fear of what might happen to them if they continued the old practices of exploitation. Local folklore began to speak of the giant seamstress, a figure who appeared whenever textile workers were being mistreated. Witnesses described her as a woman who could grow to enormous size, her needles becoming spears, her thread becoming chains strong enough to bind the most powerful men. She was said to weave justice itself into the fabric of reality, creating garments that rewarded the virtuous and punished the cruel. The story of Augustus Whitmore's death became a cautionary tale told in mill towns throughout the American South. Factory owners would warn each other about the dangers of treating workers too harshly, and more than one labor dispute was resolved when someone mentioned the rope that vanished, the seamstress who grew tall as a tree, and the justice that could be woven from moonbeams and shadow. Modern historians studying the Industrial Revolution often note the remarkable improvement in working conditions that occurred in Virginia's textile industry during the 1830s, a change that preceded similar reforms in other regions by decades. They attribute this to economic factors, changing social attitudes, and improved legislation. But in the small towns where the mills once stood, older residents tell different stories. They speak of a woman with pale green eyes who could make thread from starlight, who could weave protection into the very air around honest workers, and who could create nooses that hung men without leaving a trace of rope behind. They say she still appears from time to time, whenever the powerful forget that their wealth is built on the backs of the powerless. They say she has grown beyond human form entirely now, that she exists as much in the realm of justice as in the physical world. They say her thread connects every act of cruelty to its inevitable consequence, weaving a web of accountability that spans generations. And they say that somewhere, in a place between dreams and nightmares, Augustus Whitmore still hangs from a rope that cannot be seen, cannot be touched, and can never be cut down, a permanent reminder that some threads once woven can never be undone.